I, Pranab Mukherjee, do swear in the name of God that I will faithfully execute the office of President of India
Namaskar and welcome to this edition of DD Dialogue, which is dedicated to the life and times of the former President of India, fondly called Pranab Shri Pranab Mukherjee ji, his legacy and most importantly, his journey from a small village, Mirati in West Bengal to road to Raisena. The legacy that he leaves behind, many would have called him People's Rashtrapati. But to understand more about what Pranab Mukherjee was all about, the People's Rashtrapati, we're very, very glad to have with us on this show Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairperson, Finance Commission, and also former Member Parliament, and somebody who has had several trysts with Pranab in various capacities. Mr. Singh, this intergenerational mentor in politics is how you've of late described Pranab, your association with him. Oh, it's an interesting term. How do you define this? And when you talk about the life and times, and you've known him since 70s, how do you remember him today?
Well, I remember him as a person who was not only a mentor, which is a caption I have used in my obituary piece on him, but as I look back on time, Pranab had given guidance, membership, advisory role, guidance to people not only of his generation, even people who were older to him in his generation, always looked up to him for some kind of an advisory, so pointers. Certainly people of my generation, which is generation removed, look to Pranab as a guidance. People in the next generation, younger to me, in political, not only in political life, in many other walks of life. I mentioned in my obituary piece of a strong interest in classical music, and classical dance. I particularly mentioned about his late wife, Subra, who was in his first time when I knew him, used to conduct his classical music and classical dance,
yes.
Rabindra Sangeet, two children. So I view him as an intergenerational mentor because he did not allow narrow partisan political processes to cloud his vision. Look, for instance, a quintessential congressman was specially invited as a guest for the RSS function. Who could have imagined?
And do you think precisely because of the presence of Pranab on that dais, it became a national event? And since you talked about the RSS event, there was a lot of interest that was generated nationally. That what is he going to speak when he shares a dais with the RSS? You remember that?
Yes, I remember that. I remember those analysis, analytical writing. But let me tell you, privately too, his views were that the RSS was not merely a voluntary organization. He had told me once that of Indians, this was embedded in Pranab's psyche, that please do not go by the narrow ideologies. He had always viewed the RSS in the years that I knew him. And therefore, I was not very surprised that when he was elevated to very important positions, including the President of India, he had received across the divide, across the political spectrum, across different walks of life, a degree of unanimous support.
Just to quote from that speech, one of the powerful speeches by Pranab, only a piece of land cannot be called nation. A nation is created where one culture and one tradition lives together. Hindustan is name given to our country, and this is country of Hindus, unquote.
Yes. But Hinduism, he never said, in a very, very narrow sectarian sense
yes.
of the term. He had used the word Hinduism akin to Hindustan, which is the name of the country, in a much broader sense, not in a very narrow sector.
Yes, yes.
And therefore, I think that
share my understanding,
his own belief, and something which I think that
the concept
rest of India
of
would also
nation,
believe that it is not a narrow
nationalism,
sectarian. After all, the
and
term
patriotism
Hindustan, if you look at the origin of
in the
Hindustan,
context of
not-
India.
it is in a much broader sense that Hindu as one of the assimilating influence which has adapted, which has shaped other religions, which has also been tolerant in multiple ways. Tolerant, not antithetical to being a Hindu.
What was it, one thing about Pranabda, that he was respected across all political spectrums with his appropriate advices, the rationale that he conducted himself with. It was not about Pranab Mukherjee, the Congress leader, but Pranab Mukherjee, the statesman. Do you think the nation would remember him more of a citizen Pranab Mukherjee, more of a people's Rashtrapati Pranab Mukherjee, Pranabda, and not the Congress entity?
People will remember him in an amalgam inculcating virtues of people, the political entities, India as a partnership, India as a union of states, which the Constitution of India describes. People will remember him with the fact that he upheld the constitutional values and obligations in every political office which he held. He respected the constitutional framework, which imposes upon him certain obligations. This is right from the beginning, from the time when I had known him from the 70s. Then I directly worked with him in 80-81, when I was a special assistant, which is referred to that period of mine in his autobiography.
During his 2 stints as finance minister, if you talk about the economic reforms, the way he changed the economics, the landscape during several terms, not only as the finance minister, but also being part of the planning commission then, and so on and so forth. How do you look back that period?
Well, I look back with his great agility and his ability to respond to challenges as it grew. In his first stint, if you remember, this is much before the economic reforms had begun. It was much before India had hit the great balance of payments crisis in 1991. That was the India which he dealt with at that time. When I first knew him, and I worked with him closely, and when Mrs. Gandhi returned to power after the midterm elections in 1980, at that time, as Commerce Minister, he recognized that the trade regime needed to be adapted to meet the new challenges of enhancing India's export and the fact that our balance of payments needed the support of foreign direct investment. In fact, the audacious decision of a joint venture with aluminium PNA, with a joint venture, an important French company producing aluminium, and an Indian company, was taken at that time when he was the Minister of State for Commerce. Subsequently, when he, in his first stint as Finance Minister, he had to grapple with the challenges that India's balance payments was fragile. We were still dependent on external support of the International Monetary Fund and in the World Bank, and he dealt with an India of a different era.
Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he once said that Pranab Mukherjee was better qualified to be the Prime Minister of the country. This, I think, was one of the book launches of Pranab Mukherjee.
Let me say this, that it was obviously, since Dr. Manmohan Singh, the truthful man, obviously it was not unnatural for him that he would have been considered being the senior most person in the cabinet of Mrs. Gandhi to at least have that interim obligations. Whatever may have been the factors which went to it, I do not want to go back at that particular point in time, something that Manmohan Singh himself recognized much later. But if you look at the second last paragraph of my obituary, there is a hint.
Yes, and that's precisely why I asked this, yes.
There is a hint because in my long meetings that I used to have with him when he was the finance minister, sitting one late evening, I was still a member of parliament at that time, he said with some vision at that time, looking right through to the ceiling, that I have to get out. He used to call me Nandu. Nandu, I have to get out of this place. Where do I go? Exit to the South Block is blocked because there was no vacancy in the office of the Prime Minister. Only other place is Raisina Hills. And he left it there. I mentioned here that I couldn't do very much, but I did put Nitish Kumar ji, who was an important ally of the BJP at that time, and they spoke to each other. Nitish ji had held him in such high regard, even in multiple capacities. I think that they had a very useful conversation. And I left his room with longing hope and expectation that he would be nominated by the ruling party at that time to be the nominee for the presidential. And when he was, if you remember, it was with great unanimity and acclaim and with great dignity that he moved to the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The dignity of the office which the Rashtrapati Bhavan represents, he was acutely conscious of that. And during his period, he did everything to enhance the constitutional office, the dignity, grace, and wisdom.
Now, there's a lot being talked about the diary that Pranab maintained.
He wrote a diary every day, right? In great detail.
Yes.
By the way, I must tell you that learned Bengali politicians of that era wrote a diary every day. So did his colleague at that time, Professor Devshah Chattopadhyay. Very complete diary of each day's feelings chronicled. Pranab was in that tradition. In fact, he was one of the people who followed it with great alacrity. So when he was working on his autobiography, he told me with some lament that the diary for some particular 2 years had been destroyed in the floods and in the rains. So I said, then what will you do, Pranab? That's no problem, Nandu. I recall all those events graphically as it happened, which he did, and then wrote in his autobiography. He had never allowed the time which went by or the absence of the diary to in any way impair the computer memory which he had.
Mr. N.K. Singh, it's very difficult to describe a journey of a political journey or a personal journey spanning so many decades. But final thoughts from you, sir. How do you remember him today? The legacy.
It's a watershed with which he was the last of an era of an amalgam of politicians with a huge understanding of Indian culture, Indian history, Indian religion, and an embodiment of the quintessential of what constitutes India, its soul of India. He was one of the last very people who represented that. It is with that nostalgia that I remember him, not only as somebody who was like my mentor, but somebody with whom I had the privilege of interacting in so many multiple ways.
And he used to call you Nandu, you said. Fondly
Nandu.
call you.
That always he used to call me Nandu. Very few people call me Nandu. They call me NK, but very few people call me Nandu. He was one of those who affectionately used to call me.
You feel it's a void which cannot be fulfilled ever?
Well, I would say certainly a very big void for anyone to even try and come near what he was. It is a big void in our political life, in our cultural life, in our life of someone who understood the soul of India, as I said, in its multiple facets and multiple diversities.
Well, on that note, that someone who understood the soul of India, that's Pranab for Mr. N.K. Singh Nandu, he would fondly call you. And I think that speaks volumes of how you've really described Pranab the former president, the people's Rashtrapati, and the citizen Pranab. Thank you so much, Mr. N.K. Singh, for talking to us on Doordarshan. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Namaste India.
Namaste land.
مرحبا إلى الهند.
Salam India.
Namaste India.
नमस्कार भारत.
Muy
Nous
India.
sommes land.
نحن هنود.
India.
माँ हिंदी हस्ती
Mung Hindian.
Salam Hindustan.
We are India.
And now we're very honored to have joining us all the way from Netherlands, Ambassador Venu Rajamoni. He's India's ambassador to Netherlands, and he was the press secretary to late former President of India, Shri Pranab Mukherjee. Ambassador Venu, thank you so much, sir, for joining us on this special program dedicated to Pranab da. Many would describe him as people's Rashtrapati, and especially for the far-reaching changes and the review of protocols that he brought into the place. And I think while going through various articles and papers written on him, the way he changed a lot that used to happen, contrast traditionally what used to happen earlier, and then he tried to change few things, all meant to bring Rashtrapati Bhavan close to the people of India.
Yes, indeed. I think that is one of the most important achievements of Pranab Mukherjee's presidency. He himself came from a very humble background. He was a village boy, as he used to describe himself, from North Bengal. And having come from such a poor background and risen to the highest office in the country, he felt that it is important that Rashtrapati Bhavan does not become the preserve of a small elite group of people, but it should be opened out to the public at large, and everybody should have an opportunity to come visit the Rashtrapati Bhavan, see it, learn about its history, understand the important events pre-independence, post-independence which have taken place. A number of measures were taken in this regard, which included for the first time opening the Rashtrapati Bhavan to the public for 2 hours a week, a change of guard ceremony once a week, museums.
Yes.
That's museums which feature the buggies, as well as tell the whole history of the building and all important events leading up to the independence movement and after, under various presidents.
You were his press secretary. His record of rejecting mercy petitions is unparalleled. And I think he meant business.
Well, I'm not sure if I would like to describe him that way, especially in the context of the mercy petitions. His view on mercy petitions was not to mean business, but to say that, look, I am bound by the constitution. I am bound by the laws of the country. As long as there is a death
when
penalty.
I say business, I mean not the rubber stamp president who actually
that's correct. Let me explain. What was most important for President Pranab Mukherjee is the letter of the law, that he abides by the constitution. He used to repeatedly say that every senior official in the country swears when he takes office to abide by the constitution, but the president alone swears to preserve and protect the constitution. So he saw for himself a larger role, and on death penalty, it was not that he was particularly fond of enforcing the death penalty on anyone, but he felt as long as the provision remains in law as enacted by the parliament, he is duty bound as president to carry it out. He cannot bring in an individual view onto it or a personal view onto it. But going beyond that, I would say that President Mukherjee's effort was to make it a substantive presidency. It was not just a ceremonial presidency.
Yes.
He wanted the presidency to have substance, and he tried to bring that substance into the presidency through a number of ways. One of the most important ways was to be the conscience keeper of the nation, to be willing to speak out boldly, to be willing to advise the two governments he worked with, one led by Dr. Manmohan Singh as well as the other led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and to travel the length and breadth of the country, talking to members of parliament, legislators, teachers, students, farmers, the cross-section of the country. He said, look, I have traveled enough abroad. I don't want to travel abroad unless the foreign ministry tells me this is very important. You have to go. But I want to travel within the country. And he visited every state. He visited frontier regions. He visited tribal areas. So you asked me about him being a people's president.
Yes.
While opening up the Rashtrapati Bhavan was one factor, the other factor was also the fact that he made himself accessible and open to everyone. He was happy to meet people, whether they be senior political leaders, whether they be ministers, whether they be artists, whether they be poets, whether they be students, and whether they be teachers. But he also traveled the length and breadth of the country, trying to connect to the people and to find out what is happening in various parts.
You talked about substantive business in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Rashtrapati Mahoday should be used in place of Maha Mahim during speeches. This is what he ideally wanted, and His Excellency will be discontinued while organizing functions within the country and during interaction between Indian dignitaries and the President. What was the idea? What was the idea? Because he was very keen in reviewing these protocols and doing away with something which used to be so sacrosanct to Rashtrapati Bhavan or his predecessors. Was it about bridging the gap, being more closer to the people of the country?
Well, I'm very glad you asked this question. The Rashtrapati Bhavan in many ways is seen as a colonial building, and many of the practices in the Rashtrapati Bhavan have followed on right from the days of the British Raj. Mountbatten, who was there as Viceroy and then Governor General. So because of that, a lot of practices have not been thought through. People have just blindly pursued it. The reference which you just now made to him being called His Excellency, which he not only told everyone to stop for himself as well as for all other governors. And maybe there were some governors who are not too happy about it.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that. What was your reaction when he introduced those changes?
Yeah, so first of all, the philosophy was that the Rashtrapati Bhavan is no longer a colonial building. The Rashtrapati is not a continuation of the British past. The Rashtrapati is the head of state of modern, independent, democratic Republic of India. And he should embody that consciousness and the personality of the Republic of India, of a young, independent country where we don't stand by ceremony, but we believe in doing our work, we believe in action, we believe in getting things done. So His Excellency in diplomatic parlance across the world is normally a term which is used for foreigners. You do not use that term to address people in your own country, however high that dignitary be. And that is the point he sought to make by telling everybody, don't call me His Excellency, don't call the governors His Excellency, but refer to us like we are all ordinary citizens. In fact, after he retired from Rashtrapati Bhavan, he chose the Twitter handle, the name he chose for the Twitter handle was Citizen Mukherjee. He always saw himself as an ordinary citizen. A journalist asked him, what will you now do after finishing your tenure in Rashtrapati Bhavan? He said, I will melt into the masses. So he came from the masses, he wanted to go back to the masses, and he wanted to send the message all around that we must try and shed these colonial feudal trappings and let us try and
it's a very powerful phrase, melt into the masses, and I think that is something which described the entire personality of Pranab Mukherjee, the late president. Is it true that Mr. Mukherjee, President Mukherjee, in fact, directed authorities that most of the functions should be held in Rashtrapati Bhavan so that there is less burden on the police machinery? There should be minimal inconvenience to the people by and large. The whole concept of paraphernalia should be reduced. Is it true that he directed authorities that most of the formal functions should be held inside the premises of Rashtrapati Bhavan in order to maintain that decorum?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're very correct in that. This was part of, it is an extension of what we have already been discussing. That the president should be a friend and an ally and a supporter of the people at large, not a headache and a nuisance. And what has traditionally happened, and even now unfortunately happens, is when a high dignitary travels on the roads for security reasons, our security forces tend to shut down the roads. Traffic has to wait for a long time till the carcade passes. Absolutely. And every time you do a function outside, not just the people in that area, but the people all around are inconvenienced for security reasons. Since the Rashtrapati Bhavan is already a high security zone, he thought that it was best to advise people, look, don't trouble yourself and trouble others by inviting me out. Come here, and we have all the facilities here in the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Let us do it here. And this was sent out to authorities in Delhi as well as all the states whenever he traveled to keep both security and protocol to the minimum and to make sure that you don't inconvenience the public in any manner.
Ambassador Venu, you interacted with him on daily basis 24/7 in the capacity of his press secretary. What would you say has been the most or one of the most defining moments of Pranab Da as the former president? He was certainly looked up across the political spectrum, extremely respected.
Well, I think there are many special moments, but if I can say two moments, if you will permit me. One, when Prime Minister Modi came into power, Prime Minister Modi came to call on the president and the president invited him to form the government. One of the first things that Prime Minister Modi asked him was, can I invite heads of states of all South Asian countries to attend the swearing in? Now, the swearing in had to be held in a few days. It had to be held in Rashtrapati Bhavan. This was something completely unprecedented. It had never before been done. A great deal of activity had to be undertaken at very short notice to try and make Prime Minister Modi's wish happen. But President Mukherjee had no hesitation in saying, I think it's a very good idea. Let's do it. I will make sure that from the Rashtrapati Bhavan side, everything possible will be done. And the second moment, of course, is a sad moment, a tragic moment, which is when his wife passed away while he was in Rashtrapati Bhavan. He was, in the morning, he had to take the body to the cremation ground. He completed all the rituals as per the traditional manner. But that evening, there was a pre-scheduled appointment. A foreign dignitary was to come and call on him.
Okay.
So, his entire team, including me, advised him, so you can cancel this, people will understand this is a moment of grief for you. It doesn't matter if you're the dignitary. But he said, no, duty always comes first. Give me my talking points, give me my brief. I will do my responsibilities.
And he went ahead.
Ahead with the meeting.
He had very strong thoughts on the need for allowing debate and discussion to take place in Parliament, extremely strong thoughts on the rule by ordinance, extremely strong thoughts in respect for following best practices, parliamentary practices. Ambassador Venu, what I'm trying to ask you, what according to you was something that set Pranab Da or former President Mukherjee apart from his predecessors? I know it's a very tricky question, but you can attempt that.
I think we don't have to compare him to his predecessors, but I would say that he was a Democrat to the core, and he was steeped in the parliamentary tradition. He had spent 43 years in Parliament. He came into Parliament first in 1969, and he had become a minister by 1973. So having seen the Parliament evolve over the years, and also as a scholar and a person fond of history as well as political science, he knew modern Indian political history very well. He was a great admirer of Pandit Nehru, and particularly Pandit Nehru's performance as a parliamentarian, his contributions to building of parliamentary traditions. So because of all this, he felt very strongly, he was very hurt when he saw members of parliament or legislators misbehave, when we saw that parliament and legislatures were not performing their duties as they should. And that is where he would always, repeatedly, he made it a point to visit legislatures, to meet parliamentarians, and he used opportunities to talk to them, to say democracy means 3 Ds: debate, discussion, dissent. There is no room for disruption.
Part of his presidential speech, and I'm sure you remember that. I'm just going to quote the excerpts. I have seen vast, unbelievable changes during my journey that has brought me from flicker of lamp in small Bengal village to chandeliers of Delhi. Flicker
Absolutely.
of lamp to chandeliers of Delhi, quote unquote.
So that was something which he always kept in his mind. And that was what gave him the humility which he represented, despite having been a parliamentarian, a senior political leader, minister holding very important portfolios, and finally the president. So his legacy is going to be of a president who came from a very poor background to the highest office, who was a Democrat firmly by his conviction, who was a parliamentarian par excellence, who believed in the transformation of India, who believed that education was the alchemy which can change the future of India, and who believed in its youth, who thought that teachers needed to be respected. He himself, having been a teacher, they need to be honored, they need to be recognized. And more than anything else, a person who believed that India's biggest strength lay in its multiculturalism, in its pluralism, that every people from all parts of the country, every corner of the country, to be brought together and united in the exercise of
Thank you very much, Ambassador Venu, for joining us live all the way from Netherlands. You've been ex-president's press secretary for full 5 years. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. In the words of Pranab Da, democracy is not a gift but a sacred trust, quote unquote. Well, this is what actually defines Pranab Da from Mirati village in West Bengal and the journey that he undertook, the road to Raisena Hill. People's Rashtrapati to citizen Pranab Mukherjee. The life and the times of Pranab Da, the legacy of Pranab Da cannot be really described in words.